All right, well, good evening all. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the second of our presentations about how to qualify for the UCI Granfondo World Championships at the Granfondo Vosges on May the 19th. My name is Marvin Faure and I'm the founder and general manager of Alpine Cols, a team of cycling coaches based in the Alps. I made our first presentation on part one of the training plan on the 23rd of November, and it's now available in the Alpine Cols channel on YouTube if you want to go back and look at that. Today, of course, I'm presenting part two, and then on the 2nd of May, I'll present hints, tips, strategy, and tactics for getting your best result on the day itself. Before getting into the meat of it, I just want to take a minute to talk about our pre-race coaching camp. This is a 4-day camp designed around the Granfondo Vosges to give you the best chance to qualify. The camp will begin in the evening of Wednesday, May the 15th, and includes a 4-day accommodation package, as well as entry to the event. On Thursday and Friday, we'll take you on a reconnaissance of the key parts of the route. Saturday will then be an easy day before the race on Sunday. The coach to rider ratio will be 1:6 or better, so you'll have plenty of one-on-one coaching. There'll be a strong focus on race technique, both on the bike and during the evening sessions. We'll include presentations on topics such as analyzing the event, making a race plan, bike handling, positioning in the peloton, managing energy, nutrition, as well as specific race tactics, of course. Here's a very typical quote of the sort of feedback we get from our camps. James said, "I would recommend Alpine Cols to anyone who is serious about improving their skills on a bike." So there you go. We got dozens more quotes like that if you want more testimonials. Now, that's the end of the publicity. It makes little sense to talk about training to qualify for the Worlds until you know what it takes. So let's take a look at what happened in 2023. These are the finishing times and average speeds for the slowest qualifier in each category at the Granfondo. The rule is that the first 25% in each category are qualified. So depending on your age, in 2023, you needed to achieve an average speed somewhere between 29 and 32.7 kilometers per hour. Considering the amount of climbing, this is a pretty high standard. There's no reason to expect anything different in 2024. Coming now to the Medio Fondo, here's the same data for the men aged 60 and above and for all the women. I'm not going to comment this in detail other than to say that it's also a pretty high standard. Don't forget the average speed is on a course with a lot of climbing. So you can't compare this with your average speed on a flat course. Make sure you compare things which are comparable. So coming back to my question, what does it take to achieve at least these average speeds? Because if you're slower than that, then you're very unlikely to qualify. For those of you who have already seen part one, this is now going to be a reminder. So I'll go through it quite quickly. If you haven't seen part one, I recommend listening to the YouTube video to gain a deeper understanding of what I'm about to say. The most important physical characteristics you need to qualify are: 1, a high power to weight ratio for the climbs. 2, excellent aerobic endurance. There'll be 5 to 6 hours of total cycling with multiple climbs. And in addition to those two, you need mental strength. It's going to be a hard race. You need the ability to climb and descend well, the ability to pace yourself, and last but not least, the ability to eat and drink enough to fuel your ride properly. So your training plan should therefore address all of these points. In part one, I presented these general principles and the structure of our training plan at some length. So again, I'm just going to spin through this very quickly as a reminder. Point 1 is to make qualification your priority. Point 2 is to be consistent. Train hard to race easy is a good mantra. Build a strong aerobic base. That's the base for everything in endurance sport. Develop your fat burning capacity. Build short-term muscular endurance. Do as much climbing as possible. Increase the load progressively. Recover to get stronger. Monitor your readiness for high load and develop your technical skills. So I went into all of those in some detail in part one. If some of them don't make sense to you and still don't make sense at the end of this video, then please go back and listen to part one. The plan has 3 phases: the preparation or base phase, which finishes in a week's time, then the pre-competition phase running until the first week of May, and finally the competition or taper phase for the last 1 or 2 weeks. So today, of course, I'm focusing on the pre-competition phase only. Here you can see our framework training plan, which you can download from the Granfondo Vosges website under training plan, quite simply, or just send me an email to request it. As I've said before, it's a framework and not a detailed day-by-day training plan. The idea is that you take the framework and design your own training plan that will perfectly be tailored for you. And there's no way I can do that without knowing you. And there's no way that any one plan can work for everybody. So you need to adapt it. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking about principles more than the detail. The second page of this plan provides you with a typical training week and some suggested workouts during each period. Let me remind you that the harder you intend to race, closer to the front of the race you intend to be, the more you need to do in terms of intervals and high intensity. But it should never be more than 2 sessions per week. Now let's take a look at what should be in part 2 of your training plan from now to May. The key objectives or focus during this period are: 1, to strengthen your aerobic endurance so you can ride hard up to 6 hours without undue fatigue. 2, to work on your durability, which is the ability to repeat the climbs without losing power. So climb after climb, you can power up it at the same level, which of course it takes a lot of training. 3, optimize your nutrition so that you're fueling your training, facilitating your fat oxidation, and finally training your gut for the large amount of carbs that you need to eat during the race itself. And 4, it's important to start simulating race conditions at least 2 or 3 times before the event. And finally, include some exercises to sharpen your technical skills, such as group riding, descending, and cornering at speed. So those are the main objectives of this block, this period, and the main focus. So now let's look at how to do it. First, how to strengthen your aerobic endurance. Well, it's fairly simple, really. You just need to do as many long rides as possible and at a low intensity. The key metric here is time, not distance. If your goal is distance, you'll be tempted to ride fast to finish early, which is contrary to what you're trying to achieve here. The point of the long rides is to develop your aerobic endurance and fat burning capacity, and this is optimum at low intensity. The faster you ride, the more you will be burning carbs instead of fat. So set a target of time to ride, not distance, and make sure you stay below that first threshold. I'll talk about the first threshold a bit more in a minute. For most people, this means not much above 60% of your maximum heart rate or your FTP. Now, a problem for some people is that they find these long, slow rides boring. So it's important to understand why you should do them. Let me begin with a quote from Professor Saint-Milan, who is not only one of the world's foremost experts on metabolism, but is also the principal trainer at Team UAE Emirates and for a certain Tadej Pogacar that you may have heard of. So what does Inigo say? For the past 18 years, working with professional and elite endurance athletes like cyclists, runners, triathletes, swimmers, and rowers, I've been able to see that Zone 2 training is absolutely essential to improve performance. Okay, so for this to work, you obviously need to know what your zones are. You have to make sure your training zones are accurate. In my experience, most people believe their Zone 2 is much higher than it really is. I'm showing here a typical 5-zone model with the 2 physiological markers that we call thresholds, LT1 or VT1, so it's the first lactate threshold or the first ventilatory threshold, and then the second is critical power or FTP, functional threshold power, which are very much the same thing. Now, remember that all so-called thresholds are in fact a range, and they're certainly not constant, and they vary with your level of fitness, but also with your short-term fatigue. If we tested your FTP at the end of a hard ride, it would be a long way below what it would be if we tested it at the start. So how do we determine these two key thresholds? The first one, LT1, or the aerobic threshold, which is at the top of zone 2. And the best way to determine that is via a lactate test, for which you need a lactate tester, or you need to go to a lab, ideally. That obviously takes time, it's difficult, there aren't that many labs around, it's expensive, so not many people do that. Failing that, there's a very good test, which is simply the talk test, which means that if you cannot talk easily in complete sentences and, in fact, talk normally while you're riding to your riding companion, then you're going too fast. And another way you can test for LT1 is to do a so-called breathing test on a turbo, which is fairly difficult to get right. But the basic idea is you start off at a very low intensity where you're breathing completely normally as if you weren't doing any exercise at all, and you increase the intensity by small steps. And after a moment, at a certain point, you're going to notice that your breathing is starting to get deeper and heavier. And that will be the equivalent of VT1, the first ventilatory threshold, which is the same as LT1. You'll give or take a couple of beats. So that's how you can determine your first threshold, which is the critical one when you're riding at low intensity. The second one, it can be determined either by critical power or by functional threshold power. And the two are really very, very close. We come at them in a completely different way, but they give very much the same answer. So you can determine critical power very simply by 3 maximum efforts. They need to be maximum efforts. So good numbers. They don't have to be these numbers, but these are good ones. 2 minutes, 6 minutes, and 15 minutes. So a max effort at each of those durations. And then you use a software package like Golden Cheetah or an online calculator to tell you what your critical power is. The other way to do it is by FTP, functional threshold power, for which you do a longer maximum effort. The minimum has to be 20 minutes, or better still, do a 45 to 60 minute maximum effort. And FTP is then somewhere around 93 to 97% of your 20-minute power. You'll sometimes see that stated boldly as 95%, but that's an average. Some people it'll be as low as 93, some as high as 97. So that's one of the problems with FTP testing. But if you've got the motivation to do the full thing and do at least 45 minutes, then your average power, if you've really gone all out, will be very close to your FTP. So that's how you determine the two thresholds. It takes some testing, it takes some effort, but it's well worth doing. Otherwise, you're really training in the dark. You just don't know where you are. Okay, so knowing your training zones accurately is important to help you with the golden rule, which is train properly. But it's not enough. You must also stick to your training plan and ignore other cyclists who may be tempting you to ride faster. It's one of the most frustrating things about training at low intensities. You're going to be passed all the time by other cyclists, and it's very tempting to jump on their wheel or to shout out to them, "Hey, I'm training at low intensity. I can ride as fast as you can." And I'm always tempted to do one or the other. But there's just no alternative. So remember, the time for being competitive is not during your training rides. Who cares if someone rides past you on your training ride at the end of the day? The time for being competitive is during competition. So to help you train properly and consistently, here are some simple research-based tips that have been proven to work. The first one is write out your weekly plan by hand. And it's important to write it out by hand rather than write it type it out on a computer because of it's reinforcing it. Use active verbs in what you write. Make the plan measurable. And if you choose to use visual reminders like post-its that you stick on your desk or on your computer or on the fridge or whatever, renew them every day, because otherwise they become part of the scenery and you no longer see them. You just start to ignore them. Here's an example weekly plan written out by hand. I effectively cheated here for the computer, but it's simulated handwriting. It's using active verbs, so complete 12 hours of training this week, including ride for 6 hours at low intensity, ride for 3 hours at low intensity, and so on and so forth. And everything on that plan is totally measurable. Okay, so that's an example. Obviously, you need to work out your own. So we've talked about aerobic endurance and what you need to do to build those long, slow rides. The second point is to work on your durability, which is your capacity to make repeated efforts at medium and high intensity. The better your durability, the more likely you are to be able to stay with the good group from beginning to end, and especially up the last climb. But there are 3 ways to work on durability. The first is to do threshold or VO2 max interval sessions. And you might, for example, do 4 by 10-minute intervals, 8 by 5-minute intervals, or 12 by 2-minute intervals. You should do at least 1 interval session per week, but no more than 2. The second way is to work on durability is to increase the intensity near the end of a long ride when your legs are tired. So you might do, let's say, a 6-hour low intensity ride and increase the pace for the last hour or the last climb or whatever it is. And the third way, of course, is to join a hard club ride at the weekend or participate in a race if there is a convenient one. But before doing a hard session, it's important to realize that you should only do it if your body is ready for it. If you do a hard session when your body is not ready for it, it's literally a waste of time because your body will not be able to create the adaptations you want. So how can you tell? Well, there's no single measure that captures everything going on. Current best practice is to look at 3 separate sets of measures that address 3 different aspects of readiness to train. The first is perceived fatigue and muscle soreness, and they provide an indication of progress in muscle tissue repair. The second is heart rate variability, which can indicate the state of your autonomic nervous system, and that's basically measuring the stress you're under. And the third is a submaximal fatigue test, an SFT, which provides an indication of accumulated fatigue and the ability to take on load linked to how much the glycogen in your muscles has been depleted. We don't have time here this evening to go into the technicalities of heart rate variability and submaximal fatigue test, but if you're interested, you can do some research on the internet, you'll find some stuff. Or you can watch our YouTube video on our YouTube channel on exactly this subject, where we've gone through that in some detail. But here's the easy stuff that anyone can do. Here are some suggested scales that are easy to use for perceived fatigue and muscle soreness. These scales come from Training Peaks. And you should note your feelings on both scales soon after you get up in the morning, and then use the scores to adapt your plan if necessary. Especially before a hard session, be honest with yourself. Red flags for doing hard sessions would be a combination of fatigue at 5 and muscle soreness at 8 and above, of course. So if in doubt, be cautious. Don't fall in the no pain, no gain trap. It's better to wait a couple of days than waste a training opportunity. So to summarize on this point, you should monitor and adjust your training load using feelings, quantified by the perceived fatigue and muscle soreness scales, and perhaps heart rate variability and a weekly submaximal fatigue test. Don't get macho and ignore the indicators. Back off when you need to and rethink the plan. Normally, it's enough to replace a planned hard session that you might have planned for today, either by an easy one or by complete rest, and then reschedule the hard session for a day or 2 later. Now, let's come to nutrition. This is a very important part of your training. I'm not going to repeat everything I said on this subject in the part 1 video, so this is mainly a reminder. The first point is to make sure that you're eating enough to fuel your training. Okay, above all, on hard days, you must eat more. And then on the easy days, eat less. The second is to continue to develop your fat burning ability that hopefully you started if you followed my presentation back in November. And the third is to train your gut to absorb enough carbohydrate during the race. So these are 3 quite different objectives. And we'll look at how to deal with each of them. So first, fueling your training. Again, I went into this in detail in part 1, so I'm not going to repeat. Just a reminder that it's important to eat a wide variety of the highest quality, non-processed foods, and to adjust the amount you eat to your energy expenditure. On a long ride, you might easily expend 3,000 or 4,000 calories, which you need to replace. Don't be tempted to take this as an opportunity to lose weight. You might indeed lose weight, but you won't gain the benefit of the training. And you will not be in good condition to train again the next day. So you're gaining, you might lose a bit of weight, but you're throwing away the essential, which is your training. So now looking at fat burning. To maintain your ability to burn fat, you need to make sure that you start your long rides at low intensity. If you start even at moderate or tempo intensity, you're going to kickstart your body into burning carbs rather than fat. So particularly if you start your ride without breakfast, so in a fasted state, stay on the safe side and don't go above 50% of your critical power or your FTP for the first couple of hours. No food for the first 2 or 3 hours, and then ramp up to 60 grams of carbs per hour from then on. So that gets you really fat burning from the start, and then you fuel the ride properly from 3 hours on. It's a totally different approach. That's for low intensity rides. It's a totally different approach on your tempo or race pace rides, or any rides with intervals. Here you need to be properly fueled for these, so you can take the opportunity to train your gut to tolerate the high amounts of carbohydrate you'll need at the race itself. If you're like most people, you probably rarely take on more than 60 grams per hour, which is the equivalent of 2 bananas or 2 gels or 2 energy bars or any combination of those per hour. There's a clear advantage in being able to use up to at least 90 grams, because this will help you conserve the glycogen in your muscles that you need for the final climb. You can try progressively increasing up to 120. That's really pushing it, but the professionals are getting there. You want to experiment with different foods. Experiment with different foods and gels to see which work for you. And don't forget, you can also drink your carbs. A bottle of energy drink includes up to 30 grams, depending on the concentration. So that's a good way, particularly when you're climbing hard. It's the easiest way to take on carbs is by drinking them. All right, the fourth area of focus is race readiness and the importance of simulating race conditions. During the last 6 to 8 weeks, you should find at least 2 or 3 opportunities to do this. Don't perhaps do it every weekend, because they're hard and could be detrimental to your training. But the easiest way to do this is probably to join a hard club ride where everybody's really pushing it for 3 to 4 hours. But better still is to sign up for an actual event where the result doesn't matter to you, and you can just use it to test and experiment. You can test your pacing strategy. You can try starting much harder than you normally would. You can try really pushing very hard up the climbs. You can try making all the things that you would normally see as a mistake and just see what happens, see how hard you can go. And also, of course, you can use it to test and experiment with your equipment and your clothing and so on. Still under simulating race conditions, you should be aware that it can sometimes be very wet in May in the Vosges. So it may well rain during the race. Racing in the rain brings several additional challenges compared to racing in bad weather. So make sure you practice it in your training. There's nothing worse than being out in the rain with poor clothing. So this is important to test until you find the best solutions for you. And the second point, of course, in bad weather is bike handling, which is obviously harder on wet and slippery roads and needs practice. So again, you're not going to learn that unless you get out and practice it in wet weather. Finally, let's talk a bit about the importance of technical skills. You should be deliberately building in practice and working on improving these skills, such as climbing, descending, riding in a bunch, and adapting your clothing while you're riding. For example, taking off a jacket or putting it back on. You can lose a lot of time if you have to stop by the side of the road to do that, and you'll definitely lose the people you are riding with. So it's well worth learning how to do that on the bike. Be aware that with rare exceptions, the people who are fast enough to qualify for the Worlds all have excellent bike handling skills, and you either won't be able to stay with them or you'll be a danger to yourself and others if you don't have a comparable level of skills. So if you know that you're weak in one or more of these areas, try to find a coach or a clubmate who can help you. Of course, if you join one of our coaching camps, we'll work closely with you to help you improve these skills. So it would be a pleasure to have you. Finally, and as always, last but not least, we need to talk about off-the-bike work. If you want to ride fast and hard, you're going to have to push harder on the pedals, which means stronger muscles. And the best way to strengthen your muscles is off the bike. You should plan on 1 or 2 sessions per week, ideally guided by a strength and conditioning coach with experience in cycling. The goal in this phase now is more to maintain the strength of your leg and core muscles than to increase them, which you should have done already. Remember to be cautious in what you're doing to limit the risk of injury. Just as a reminder, the most basic exercises which are really good are squats, lunges, planks, bridges, and so on, but there are many more. The key is to learn the proper technique to avoid injury. The second part is mobility and flexibility, which are really important to work on if your main sport is cycling, and especially as you get older, from about 40 on. I suggest 2 to 3 20-minute sessions per week using techniques like Pilates or yoga. And again, learning correct technique is vital, so do choose a practitioner who knows cycling and only takes small groups, or better still, individuals. And then finally, you should complement regularly with other physical activities, such as walking with your best friend, like I'm doing there, running, swimming, and so on and so forth. If you sit at your computer all day and cycling is your only sport, then you risk building up serious imbalances and soft tissue problems over time. A great idea is to set an alarm to ping you every hour, so you get up and move your body for 2 or 3 minutes, just every hour. And then every day try to walk for at least half an hour, or to go for a swim, or whatever it may be. All right, that's it. Given you what you need to prepare yourself well, hopefully, over these final 3 months. So rendezvous on the 2nd of May to talk about how to get your best result on the day. And in the meantime, it's up to you to train hard. If you'd like professional help to be absolutely at your best on the day, do sign up for our Vosges coaching camp starting on the 15th, or come join us in April at our camp in Provence. You can also join the many people who are benefiting from one-on-one coaching by Alpine Cols. Just drop me an email and I'll give you all the details. And you can also, you can send me an email for any questions you may have. So thank you very much for listening. Good luck with your training, and see you on the start line, hopefully in May.